I'm here. I'm going to talk to you about a process called Design Sprint. It's a book that I read originally written by Jack Knapp. And I'm going to tell you why I think it's fantastic for researchers. It's fantastic for product development, and it's just fantastic idea to be implemented by researchers. So Jake has this to say. Essentially, he says, my best work happened when I did not have enough time, and that's when he was able to find a great solution. Eric Ries from Lean Startup says, the only way to win is to learn faster than anyone else. And Tim Brown from Design Thinking says, think of a creative process as starting with a question and not an answer. Dennis has already introduced me, so I'm not going to say much about myself, except that I come from a background of being an entrepreneur, and now I'm on the other side as an academic. And I teach both at INSEAD, which is a business school in France, and at UCD. And I love being on this side. And one of the interesting things for me is that as an academic, I get to do research and I get to read lots of books, something I did not really have time to do when I was running my own businesses. And one of the books that I recently read, there are two books, I mean, there are lots of books, but there are two books that stand out for me as an entrepreneur. One was as a research of a PhD thesis done by a Swiss guy, Alex Osterwalder. And he wrote a book called Business Model Innovation, and that really changed my view of how best to run a business. And more recently, a guy by the name of Jack Knapp wrote a book called Sprint, how to solve big problems and test new ideas in just 5 days. And I really love that. First of all, both books are very easy to read. They're really practical, and now they are my mainstay of my consulting work. So I'm going to start off by talking about why I think this is great, and then I will look at how we do this and what it's all about, right? So I'm following the format that some of you may be already familiar with, that Simon Sinek talks about when he says you should always start with the why. So why do we do it? I think a lot of us, when we are developing products or in research, we face big questions every day, right? So now there's a very simple way to find answers and test them without having lots of blah, blah, blah meetings and discussions. There is a very simple process that you can use, and that's what I'm going to introduce you to. And why should we be doing this? Because many of the large companies are now actually using this as a method of testing it. I mean, Facebook, you may have seen a recent post by Facebook, where Facebook is, the recent product update, they used a sprint. This was originally developed as part of Google Ventures when Jake was working for Google Ventures. So he used this with Google, with Slack, with Uber, Savioki, and a number of companies, and he successfully used it. And just a very quick example of where that was used is that Jake uses in his book is Slack. Some of you may be familiar with Slack. In case you're not, Slack essentially is a tool to help us reduce the number of emails we get. So that was their target. And one of the interesting challenges Slack had was very quickly the technical people had actually taken Slack on, and Slack was growing really fast. They grew to 500,000 users, but they felt that they had hit a peak because the business community hadn't fully understood how best to use Slack. So they went to, so Google Ventures were an investor in Slack, So they met with Jake, and they were discussing how best they could find out of how to overcome this problem. So they put this test into place, which was called the design sprint, and essentially they try and come up with a solution in 5 days. So in the process, and I'm now cutting this short because I just have only 20 minutes to talk through about this problem, and they identified 2 potential ways to solve this problem. So first was they were going to use a bot, bit like a robot, and the second was they were going to use a guide. And the real question that they had posed in their sprint was to figure out which one should they use. So they went through the process, and they found that this bot would take at least 4 months to develop. So by using the process, they were able to dodge a bullet. And they came up with saying, okay, the simplest way to explain Slack is to use a simple guide. The end result was between February 2015 and October 2016, Slack grew from 500,000 users to 4 million users. Now, one might say, yes, if you're already familiar with Slack, you might say, well, surely Slack now has a bot. Of course, Slack does use a bot now, but they didn't spend 4 months developing something and lose this momentum. So they found a very simple way by coming up with a different way as an explanation, a guide, and they were able to overcome any long times of trying to build a feature into a product. So primarily, just like with design thinking, and we'd like to call design sprint is taking the best of design thinking and coming up with a process and really time boxing it so you can get it done very, very quickly. The outcomes clearly is to save time and money on testing projects, but there are lots of other great outcomes. And we use this all the time now in our consulting work. And one of the best things is apart from new methods, is that it brings a great bonding of teams. We bring everybody together in the one place, and everybody is on the same picture and clearly understands exactly what needs to get done and what's the vision for your company. So how does this thing work? So we spoke about why we think it's important, and let's just take a few minutes to try and understand how does a design sprint actually work. So Jake's process says we can solve a problem in just 5 days. Interestingly enough, a design company in Berlin called AJ and Smart actually condensed it even more, and their process takes 4 days. So they've taken the first 3 days and made it into 2 days. And the process that I tend to use now in my consulting assignments is the 4-day process. And interestingly enough, AJ and Smart and Jake have now partnered, and a lot of the workshops that they run, they talk about the 4-day process. You can certainly have an extended version, but we feel a process that runs from Tuesday to Friday is more powerful than trying to take all 5 days. So let's start with a Tuesday. We define the challenge, and those of you who are familiar with design thinking, this will resonate very well with you, because a lot of the concepts are directly from design thinking. In fact, I like to call sprint as design thinking and lean startup combined together on steroids. But you'd be very familiar, if you're familiar with design thinking, you'll be very familiar with these concepts. So we first of all define the challenge, and then we produce a solution, right? And then on Wednesday, we have to make decisions. So it's a complete process. Day by day, And Jake Knapp in his book outlines exactly what you have to do and gives a lot of tools here. And once you make decisions, we have a user testing, and we start to create a user test flow, and then out of that we create a storyboard. So again, design thinkers are probably very familiar with it. And then on the Wednesday, we go out there and start to make sure we find the testers. Okay, we have to find testers. And then Thursday, we prototype it. Just one day, so we have an idea, and now our next step really is to do a very quick prototype. So one day, we go out and develop a prototype. And then that same day, we make sure that the testers that we've identified are there, and we confirm those testers. And then on Friday, we test the product. Really, in this process, one of the things that Jake's research has shown is that we could test a product. We just need 5 people. And research has shown that the optimum number of testers you can get would be 15. But really, in terms of getting results, by having 5, you can get 85% of what you're trying to find out. So we do testing with just 5 key potential users of the product. And it's a 1 hour, it's a 1 hour conversation. It's not showing your product, but just seeing how your users might be starting to use it and see what's their reaction. And the way we do that actually is that we have the whole team, we bring the team together into one room, and then there is somebody else in another room interviewing the person. We have 2 cameras, one camera that is filming his body language, and one camera that is focused on the prototype and how he is using the prototype. And the rest of the team, and generally it's a team of about 5-6 people, are in another room observing exactly what the person is doing. And they are taking notes down, and they put it up on the wall. And that's what we mean by collecting feedback. So if there's something that's going right, we tend to use colors. So something, you think, wow, that's really interesting. We use a blue or a green sticky. And then if there's something that didn't quite work out, then we start to use a red sticky, and we put it all up on the board. So this is 5 different people all writing about the interaction between the user with our prototype. So during this process, and you're probably familiar with this, again, if you're into design thinking, this thing called a design squiggle. So when you're going through a sprint, you do go through a lot of uncertainty, and you yourself don't really know how it's all panning out. And gradually, it all starts to unravel itself, and soon you get a real focused answer. So what is it all about? It comes from this book, Sprint, from Jake Knapp. And Jake defines this very clearly, and it's a step-by-step process. It's really simple. It's very, very easy to understand. And he calls it the design sprint packages the greatest hits of design thinking and innovation frameworks into a fast process that any team can use. So if you are a researcher, it's really worth your while to seriously look at this and say, yes, this can be really put into good use of how to test some of my ideas. The classic design thinking process is you have the 5 steps. You might call it learn, some people call it empathy. Then you define, then you ideate, you prototype, and test. Now, that isn't necessarily time-boxed, so it can take anything from 1 week to 5 months to years. Now, what we do is we actually time box this into 4 days. So the first day, we do ideation and generate many ideas and solutions. The second day, we do the synthesis and the decision making. The third day, we prototype this, and the fourth day, we test it. So time boxed, in 4 days, we come up with a good prototype that we are able then to test. So who do we try to bring in to a sprint? Essentially, what we are trying to do with a sprint is to bring a diverse group of people. So we bring in people from maybe engineering, from marketing, from sales. And there is one key person that is essential for a sprint to work. And that person we call, in this particular case, we are showing that person as the CEO, but we call that person as the decision maker. Whenever sprint hasn't worked, Jake's research has shown that it's because the decision maker wasn't there. So I never enter into to do a sprint with any company unless we do have a decision maker. Because we don't want somebody having done all this work, that somebody comes in and says, well, actually, that's not what we want to do. So the decision maker is a key person here. And you get a chance to build and test a realistic prototype in just 4 days. And there are 4 core design principles that we use here. In fact, after reading this book, I use this now in all my classes, this concept. And it's proved to be extremely valuable and useful. The very first one is the key, and it's called together alone. And what that means is we get everybody to work alone, so you get everybody's voice heard. And then afterwards, you combine those ideas. Because more often than not, when you go into doing something in a group, what happens is the person who's most likable, or the person who has the best personality, or the person who can present the best, their voices are the ones that get heard. And yet there could be somebody who's really quiet that has a great idea. So this is one of the core principles, together alone. So you make sure everybody's voice is heard. The second part of it is coming up with something more tangible is greater than having a big blah, blah, blah discussion. So it's not about the discussion. Focus on getting something that's really tangible. The third point is many of us don't believe we are creative. But here is a process that will bring the creativity out of you. So don't worry if you are not creative. We use this in our startup boot camps. And at the start of a boot camp, I ask people, how many of you feel you have an idea? Recently, I ran this in Singapore at INSEAD. And about 8 people of a group of 40 raised their hands. We ran this process, and after the end of 4 hours, everybody had an idea, solution up on the wall. And I asked them, how many of you want to take down this idea because you don't believe in it? Not one of them did. So sometimes we feel we are not creative, but actually through a process, we can bring out the creativity. So one of the things I often say in my class, and research has proved this, is that I believe that everybody is born creative. Because if we aren't born creative, we wouldn't be able to learn how to talk and walk and do all the things that we do. But NASA research has proved this because they found that when they did a particular experiment on the creativity of children, they found between the ages of 0 and 5, 98% of them were creative geniuses. When they went back and did the research again, once they were 10, that number had actually dropped to about 40%. By the time they got to 15, that number had dropped to 20%. They did a separate study on 2,000 adults, that same program, and they found that actually only 2% of these adults were creative. So somehow that creativity that we are born with is actually lost. And here's a process that really helps to bring your creativity. And finally, the important point is getting started is more important than being right. And I guess this is often a problem for many of us, is that we feel we have to have something really perfect, right? Instead, what is important is let's start something and then gradually make it better and better. And this rule probably applies in most cases, unless you're talking about life and death, right? You're putting a man on the moon, you're giving them a particular a drug or something. Well, of course, getting it right is critical. But in most cases, getting started is more important than being right. So that essentially, I hope, convinces you of the power of this sprint. And I hope it gave you a flavor. And I also hope that you get a chance to read this book because it's so powerful. Thank you.